In his third chapter, O'Neill helps us with understanding nations and society. Recall that nation was part of the description of a country where you have the state, regime, and government on one element, and another element you have the nation. Together that they make up the country. So here we'll take a look at some of the inner workings of nations and society. Identity, identity in the state, the concept of the nation state, conflict that's born from these conditions, these types of issues. And then we'll take a look at attitudes and ideologies, and then finally political culture. All of this helping to shape or at some point impacting the shape of government, political institutions, and even the state as a political institution as well. Up to now, we've talked about institutions and trying to identify things that have fewer variables and are more stable in analysis. Well, society is a bit different. And so the question is, why is it important to the scientist? Society and these elements are clearly within the realm of multi-causality, tremendous variables at play. However, there are some legitimate questions and legitimate value to looking at society in a scientific way. Why and how do individuals gather and agree to societal constraints? Are there gatherings that are inherently stronger or more stable than others? The Kurds, for instance, come to mind in the Middle East. Can we analyze or predict cause and effect on a country's stability regarding societal norms of ethnicity and nationalism? A country's stability, Afghanistan jumps into mind. What are the impacts of ideas? Can they shape the society and its political institutions? In this case, the United States comes to mind in terms of political attitudes and political ideologies. For our purposes, ethnicity is defined as specific attributes or societal institutions that make one group of people culturally different from others. Examples are race, culture, and religion, and each have various markers: language, clothing, diet, family names, and those other types of markers that identify the ethnicity of a group. And we'll define national identity as a group that desires self-government through an independent state. There may be an ethnic component, but not always. It is inherently political and the basis for nationalism. As analysts, we'll need to be careful to realize that not all ethnicities or ethnic groups agree politically to form nations, and then also that not all nations are countries. A few countries seem to be dominated, probably mostly in Asia, by single ethnic groups. But as you can see from this graphic, which is a portrayal of the ethnic language issues across the African continent, that those issues permeate and cross over country boundaries. And there are pockets of various groupings within countries as well. So they create cleavages, if you will, within a country, which gets back to how does a state wield power to deal with such issues within the country. Some of those divisions are manifest in permanent change or seemingly permanent change, as the example of North and South Korea. Many countries possess multiple nations, the example of United Kingdom, for instance, Nigeria, and I'd offer even Afghanistan in terms of the various nations that permeate the various regions within that country. Many nations lack states of their own. Palestinians, of course, Kurds mentioned earlier, the Rohingya, which are a tragic case in South Asia, actually in Burma and Bangladesh and Thailand. And there are other nations out there that simply don't have a state of their own, creating tension, impacting state power, creating cleavages that countries have to deal with. And how they deal with it is the objective of a good analysis, a good comparative analysis within the domestic politics of a country. Probably one of the more important roles of the state, or that a state can do for the country, is to have a capacity for the connection it can make to the people. Formal relationships between the state and the people that develop pride in one's country, pride in one's state. So citizenship is a very important aspect of the state's role here in firming up the relationship of the society and the people with respect to the country. And as you can see, citizenship is a very personal connection between an individual and the state, and it comes with a promise from the state for various rights and other privileges as would be afforded to a citizen. States can be significantly challenged with dealing with differences between groups, ethnic and national identities. The degree to which the state succeeds in managing the cleavages between groups is really a reflection on state power at some level, the capacity to handle the differences and set conditions for consensus. Very well done, obviously, in the United States. Although, as we can see from these other examples, states have generally failed in bringing together various groups. Mostly in the Middle East, we see the Sunni Shia divide, as well as the Kurdish groups, all in Iraq, which is a state that we could probably analyze as having a fairly low level of capacity. Afghanistan, there are at least 5 major ethnic groups that are regionally arrayed within that country, as listed here, and again, having trouble, almost impossibly, reconciling the differences amongst these groups. Again, it may be a measure of state power, state capacity to bring these groups together. Sometimes the state has managed to keep groups together, and then a change happens and the groups fracture and violence erupts. And as this case maybe demonstrates, it is born sometimes from a change in regime, and we could spend a lot of time in the Balkans and analyze what happens to a region when the countries within it have issues of domestic political politics that change major elements of the politics. In this case, probably regime, certainly government. And again, the conflicts within the state are really challenging for the state, and something that a political science, a comparative politics analysis really needs to bear down on and hopefully try to identify behaviors and predictability within those environments. Nigeria also provides a fairly stark example of the effect of ethnic and national divides within a country that flare up into conflict within the state. And of course, in Nigeria, we see the extreme divisions, a political exclusion and corruption. Again, this gets us back to state capacity, state power. income inequality, conflict over oil revenues, I would submit that there's also a possibility in this type of a state domestic environment for separatism. And we'll see a lot of countries, particularly in Asia and elsewhere, where the conflicts are so insurmountable that there's agreements for separatism um, within the countries themselves to resolve the conflict. India, on the other hand, seems to have succeeded amidst tremendous pressure borne by multiple issues of ethnic and national cleavage. The language barriers alone are stark within India. Um, so, as a state, India has done some fairly wise things. And in this case, once again, demonstrating a capacity, if you will, to wield state power for the good of the country. English and Hindi are national languages, the recognition of the holidays of all major religions, asymmetric federalism powering a devolving power down to various regional governments, inclusive political system where there's a parliamentary system and not a presidential system. We'll talk more about that as we discuss democracies. All efforts by the state to address some significant ethnic issues. There is some caution, though, as we can see on the right side of this chart. The BJP party and its policies with respect to nationality. Muslims are beginning to feel disenfranchised, perhaps. There is a problem with corruption, and although there seems to be a fairly good capacity for the state to wield power to keep ethnic conflict at bay, providing other services, however, seems to be an issue, particularly within the realm of infrastructure, where the state is lacking in capacity to deliver some fairly basic goods and services. Two important concepts within a society are listed here on this chart. They represent the thinking and the ideas of the people in terms of rates of change of politics or governance. Think of those as political attitudes. And ideologies are really values that are fundamental goals within politics, within governance. And it's important that we understand and agree to the elements of both of these. And so it's particularly important to be careful with lexicon as we discuss the inner workings of both of these concepts. So it's very important for us to make sure we're speaking the same political science language. The meaning of the word liberal, for instance, is not for our purposes, a description of someone who's a left-wing policy advocate. A liberal in the political attitude realm is someone who supports gradual change within existing institutions. So current state of play is okay, however, there's need for some change. A liberal as a political ideology is not a socialist or even further left, but as someone who embraces freedom. So looking at the freedom versus equality equation we spoke of earlier, a liberal is someone who really is intent on the freedom side of the scale, placing a high value on personal, political, and economic liberty or freedom. Similarly, a conservative in the political attitude realm is someone who is very happy with status quo and favors the existing institutions and traditions and really resists any changes to them. From a political ideology standpoint, there really is no particular conservative ideology distinguishable from a liberal ideology. So, conservatism, for our purposes, is not an ideology, and you will not see that in this course listed as an ideology. We'll talk more about ideologies later, but keep in mind that conservative is purely, for comparative politics purposes, a measure of change. In this case, the conservatives would prefer no change from existing institutions and traditions. In addition to perhaps the more measured attitudes of liberals who prefer gradual change and conservatives who don't and prefer the status quo, we have higher rates of desired change in radicals and reactionaries. Radicals really prefer large institutional changes much more than a liberal would. And reactionaries really seek change to return to the good old days, if you will, restore political, social, and economic institutions of the past. So those two, with liberals and conservatives, really provide us the four attitudes with respect to rates of change of institutions. Looking at these four again, perhaps in pairs of commonality. Again, you have liberals who favor gradual change and believe that the existing structure can benefit from it, but not change it entirely. The radical part of maybe a liberal attitude is more in favor of dramatic, often revolutionary change of existing political, social, or economic order, and that the old institutions that perhaps the conservative and reactionaries would prefer are completely broken. So there's a newness that's needed. And within the radical political attitude rate of change, you can see violence to force the change. And the second pairing here would be conservatives and reactionaries. Against the conservatives are maybe the more moderate thinking in terms of change. In this case, they prefer no change, and that traditions really should be respected. Reactionaries would say, no, traditions have been eroded and we need to go back to the older systems. And as an example here, the US Tea Party, I'm not entirely sure that's fair, but reactionaries, like the radicals, are very much interested in some movement, in some higher rates of change. In this case, reactionaries looking to go back to older traditions. You could say, in the US example, reactionaries would be those who really embrace foundational principles of the United States as really our basis, and we should return to those documents and the thinking that surrounded their development. Somewhat unlike radicals, reactionaries will tend not to be violent. There is a possibility, but not nearly as much as within the radical realm. Turning now to political ideologies, we have the five that we will study in this course. Liberalism looks at the individual freedom part of our guiding ideal, reconciling freedom and equality. Liberalism really looks to the freedom side of that equation. Communism, on the other hand, is way to the other side of that balance, freedom versus equality. So economic equality is where the communist would fall out ideologically. Social democracy, however, is looking for a balance between freedom and equality. And fascism is really based on the advancement of a superior group or race, and anarchism is the elimination completely of any state power. So these are our 5 ideologies, and we'll step through each one in the remaining charts. You can see the attributes of liberalism as a political ideology listed on this chart, basically limiting the state's role in people's lives. People are individuals, they pursue their own interests. Again, the freedom side of the freedom versus equality equation. The example provided of Jefferson as a champion of this ideological thinking. And of course, the inspiration for liberal democracy that the United Kingdom and the United States and others enjoyed. The attributes of communism as an ideology, the right side of the freedom versus equality equation. Freedom is the bill payer to ensure that equality exists and is shared across the general population. Karl Marx, obviously, being the champion of this ideology, which was enjoyed in the Soviet Union and is currently at play in some shape in China and in Cuba. Attributes of social democracy. Again, the motivation here for this ideology is the balance, if you will, between liberal freedom and equality of condition. The interesting thing about social democracy is that it still favors the attributes of capitalism, strong markets, role for private property ownership, but the state has a strong role in ensuring the various social safety nets that get toward the equality side of the equation. Interesting quote from Tony Blair: the challenge that social democracy has is in balancing the finances, especially, that are required to get toward the equality side of the equation. Germany and Scandinavian states seem to be excelling at this and provide really good examples of social democracy in action. The attributes of fascism as a political ideology, fortunately not as prevalent today as it was in the early 20th century. However, it's still an ideology that is worth keeping an eye on. It's oriented around the notion of a superior race. It's ultra-nationalism with respect to that race and ethnocentricity. And we can see our champion of the ideology in his quote. And one could argue that the ISIS ideology somewhat approximates this type of political ideology, political thinking. And the 5th of our 5 political ideologies is anarchism and its attributes as listed here. There really is no state currently that is dominated by this particular ideology. That's not to say that the ideology, however, does not exist and is a factor within the domestic politics of a country. And lastly, the analyst needs to be at least aware of this concept of political culture, which is a difficult thing to define as suggested by O'Neill. But basically, what are the institutions and norms that define a society and then therefore help determine the ideology, whether it's liberal, social democrat, that dominates a country's political regime? Engelhardt takes an effort at identifying within four categories where societies are with respect to traditional versus secular, rational values, and survival versus self expression values. And he's determined that these particular items don't change very much within a society, even within economic upheaval uh, within the society. So, to the extent that, again, political culture influences and shapes the general ideology and therefore political regime, or it could, is a source of information and data that the political science analyst, comparative politics analyst needs to be aware of, and something that perhaps is worthy of further analysis in a comparative analysis of a country or a series of case studies. In summary, then, of O'Neill's third chapter, we looked at identity in terms of ethnic and national interests, and how ethnic identity and national identity are different but powerful entities with which the state has to contend. And number three, to avoid conflict. Also, number two, we looked at identity and the state in regards to the individual's relationship with the state. And lastly, we reviewed the concept of political attitudes and political ideologies and how they help shape policy and government and institutions within the state. Reminder of the importance of clarity in using the terminology within both of those items, particularly in terms of liberal, conservative, as we talked earlier. And then lastly, we took a brief look at the society and its impact on shaping government and regime by way of a fairly enduring political culture that exists within the society.